It was a warm spring evening in rural Winton, California, a golden early summer night with the sun still lingering in the sky. 15-year-old Vanessa Dawn Smith stepped out of her house for her usual evening walk, a routine she often shared with her mother. But on May 31st, 1997, Vanessa went out alone, carrying the simple walking stick she liked to bring for a sense of security. She promised to be back before dark. Her mother watched as Vanessa headed down Winton Way toward the nearby almond orchards, not realizing it would be the last time she saw her daughter. Vanessa was a shy 15-year-old growing up in a close-knit Mennonite family in Winton. She loved spending time with her family and church. Almost every night, she and her mother Beverly would take a walk together through their rural neighborhood. The night Vanessa vanished was one of the few times she went walking alone, simply because her mom was busy with chores after dinner. The very day she disappeared, Vanessa had enjoyed a school picnic celebrating the end of the year. After the picnic, Vanessa had dinner with her parents and then wanted to go on her regular walk. Eager to be outdoors, Vanessa told her mom she would take a short walk by herself and be back before sunset. Around 7 p.m., she headed out along Winton Way and then turned onto Mercedes Avenue to make her usual loop through the orchards back home. It was broad daylight in their quiet neighborhood, and the route was peaceful and familiar. It was a rural road, lined with orchards and the occasional farmhouse, not a place where anyone imagined danger lurking. When dusk arrived and Vanessa still hadn't returned, her parents knew something was wrong. Art and Beverly Smith rushed out to search the route. As they neared a bend in the road, their hearts dropped. On the roadside lay Vanessa's wooden walking stick. They shouted her name into the empty dusk, but no answer came. The Smiths immediately called the Merced County Sheriff's Department, and thankfully they didn't simply dismiss her as a runaway. Officers and neighbors joined the search, combing the area with flashlights into the night, but no additional clues turned up. No neighbors heard screams or saw any suspicious vehicle. The community was left shaken and baffled, and authorities had little to go on beyond the fact that foul play was almost certain. All that remained was that lonely walking stick, a silent, inanimate witness to whatever had happened to her. Investigators treated Vanessa's disappearance as an abduction from the very start. They did consider the chance of a random stranger attack, but the circumstances seemed to point to someone she knew. Those close to Vanessa noted that she would have been unlikely to willingly get into a stranger's car. It was more plausible that a familiar face had approached her. The Merced County Sheriff's Office stated that they believed Vanessa was likely abducted by an acquaintance, someone local who knew her routine. Detectives theorized that Vanessa might have let her guard down if a trusted person stopped to talk to her, giving the abductor a chance to grab her before she could react. Police looked at local offenders and suspicious characters, but found no links to Vanessa's case. No solid suspect ever emerged in the initial investigation, and despite extensive searches and interviews, the trail went cold. A possible break in the case finally came decades later when in 2019, an elderly Winton couple came forward with new information. Around 7 p.m., on the night Vanessa vanished, they saw a teenage girl with a walking stick on Mercedes Avenue, almost certainly Vanessa. More importantly, on their way home via a different road, they witnessed an incident they described as suspicious that same evening. They admitted fear kept them silent until then, but they ultimately gave a detailed statement to authorities. While the specifics remain confidential, investigators say this late testimony supports the theory that a local individual was involved and gives hope that the case can still be solved. Armed with this information, the Sheriff's Department renewed its commitment to cracking the case. To this day, the question of who took Vanessa and why still haunts Winton. Investigators suspect that someone in the community knows the truth, and they have repeatedly urged anyone with information to come forward. In the years since Vanessa disappeared, her story has been kept alive by her loved ones and the community. The case was featured on America's Most Wanted and is periodically revisited by local media on anniversaries. The case is still open, and authorities continue to urge tips from the public, and they insist the case isn't closed and say they'll continue investigating until Vanessa is found. Notably, a $50,000 reward is on offer for information leading to a resolution. One of the more unsettling theories surrounding Vanessa Dawn Smith's disappearance centers on the idea that someone in the local community knows exactly what happened. And this isn't just my crazy speculative theory, since we actually have strong circumstantial evidence to suggest that this could be the case. When that elderly couple came forward with information they had withheld for 22 years, they mentioned that fear was a major factor in not initially coming forward. This couple may just be incredibly cowardly, since we don't know all the details. However, the idea is chilling, that someone so dangerous, so deeply feared, could scare witnesses into silence for such a serious crime. It was an ordinary summer evening on June 26, 2025. 29-year-old Rachel Dawson, a devoted fiancée and caregiver, told her family she was stepping out for a quick walk near her rural home in Irving, Kentucky. When Rachel didn't return or answer her phone, her worried fiancé, Caleb Thompson, tracked her cell phone to a Red Roof Inn about 30 miles away in Winchester. Thompson and other family members rushed to the motel and alerted authorities, who arrived with sirens blaring. Officers raced inside, bracing for the worst, and inside one of the motel rooms, they found Rachel. The young woman who had been full of life just hours before was now lying unresponsive on the floor. Paramedics and police could do nothing. Rachel Dawson was pronounced dead at the scene. The initial indications pointed to a substance overdose, which baffled her loved ones. Rachel had no history of usage and was even known to be fearful of illicit substances. Upon further digging, the motel room had been rented by a 44-year-old man named Brian Epperson, who was nowhere to be found when police arrived. Court records later confirmed Epperson had booked that room, and when officers tracked him down, they discovered meth in his truck. Epperson was promptly arrested on drug possession charges, while detectives sent Rachel's body for an autopsy to determine the exact cause of death. From the start, Rachel's family doubted that her death was an accident. They knew she would never voluntarily use meth. They also had no idea who Brian Epperson was, or how she would have crossed paths with him. Epperson, 44, worked as a home improvement contractor in central Kentucky, a job that often put him in contact with new people in their homes. When police apprehended him, they quickly learned that this was not the first time Epperson had been linked to a suspicious death. In fact, Epperson was already facing a charge in a separate but eerily similar case, the overdose death of 32-year-old Kristen Morris in May 2025. Morris was found unresponsive at a rental cabin in Powell County on May 31st, with Epperson present at the scene. Her toxicology report later revealed an astronomically high level of meth in her system, nearly 300 times a typical fatal overdose. Disturbingly, beyond the overdose investigations, Epperson has also been accused of other predatory behavior. In July 2025, he was charged with video voyeurism in an unrelated case after an ex-girlfriend discovered a hidden camera in her bedroom. Police say Epperson had given the woman a digital clock containing a secret recording device, and a search of his phone uncovered illicit footage that he had secretly recorded. This revelation painted a picture of a man with dangerous, obsessive tendencies, someone who was willing to violate others' privacy and safety in deeply invasive ways. As detectives dug into Epperson's background, a chilling pattern began to emerge. In both Rachel's and Morris's deaths, investigators recovered unusual gelatin capsules filled with meth. This method that suggested the victims had been deliberately dosed with lethal quantities of the substance. Perhaps most striking, a review of Epperson's phone and online activity yielded evidence of planning. Investigators discovered that he had recently searched the internet for overdose deaths, and they found an Amazon receipt for the purchase of empty pill capsules. In other words, it appeared Epperson had researched how to fatally overdose someone and had acquired the tools to do it. When questioned, he claimed he did not know the women were dead and did not admit to spiking the capsules. With two cases now linked, authorities also revisited a third mysterious death: the November 2024 overdose of a woman named Hillary Davis in Lexington. Davis had been found dead in a hotel room under similar conditions, and detectives now identified a tie between Davis and Epperson. Although Davis's case had initially been treated as an accidental overdose, it's now part of the broader investigation into Epperson's activities. Police publicly named Brian Epperson as the primary suspect in all three women's deaths and began exploring the possibility that there are even more victims beyond these cases. Winchester police have put out a public call for anyone who has ever interacted with Brian Epperson to come forward with information. Kentucky State Police have similarly urged families of any overdose victims with possible ties to Epperson to contact authorities. The full extent of the alleged crimes of Brian Epperson remain unknown at present. It's also important to remember that Brian Epperson remains innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here reminding you not to hit like or subscribe, and advising you that you definitely shouldn't hit that notification bell. Just kidding. Hit all the usual stuff, please, and thank you, and maybe check out the Patreon as well. Anyway, let's get back to business. For over 3 decades, a mystery haunted the city of Garden Grove, California. On a quiet night in May 1987, 23-year-old Shannon Lloyd was found brutally slain in the house where she rented a room. The discovery of her lifeless body, evidence of a violent struggle and a life cut short, sent shockwaves through the community and left police puzzled and desperate for answers. Who would do this to a young mother in her own home, and would the perpetrator ever be brought to justice? Those questions lingered for decades, until a remarkable breakthrough in forensic science finally cracked the case wide open. Shannon was a mother to a young son and had a steady boyfriend who often visited her. She lived in a rented room on Donna Lane in Garden Grove, an Orange County suburb where she was striving to build a good life for herself and her kid. By all accounts, Shannon was a devoted mother who was just trying her best, making the violent end to her life all the more heartbreaking. Late on May 21st, 1987, the unthinkable happened. Shannon's roommate, a 70-year-old man who shared the house, found her slain shortly before midnight. Panic ensued as he rushed to a neighbor's home to call the police and report the horror he had discovered. When officers arrived, they found a grim scene. Shannon had been indecently assaulted and strangled to death in her own room. There were no obvious signs of forced entry, and nothing of value appeared to be missing, which immediately deepened the mystery. It seemed that Shannon had either willingly let her perpetrator into the house, or perhaps knew the person who did this to her. Crucially, in 1987, forensic DNA analysis was still in its infancy, so investigators didn't have today's powerful genetic tools at their disposal. With limited technology and no eyewitnesses, they had to rely on traditional detective work, which unfortunately yielded no answers at the time. Detectives worked tirelessly in the aftermath of the act. They canvassed the neighborhood and interviewed everyone who knew Shannon, from her boyfriend to local acquaintances. Neighbors told police that while Shannon was mostly friendly and kind, there had been occasional visitors who raised eyebrows. One neighbor mentioned that some rough-looking men would occasionally stop by. On a few occasions, police had even been called to the house prior to the attack, though the reasons for those visits remained unclear, at least to the public. All of these details gave investigators leads to chase, but none led to an immediate suspect. Despite the thorough investigation, the case frustratingly remained unsolved. Within a short time, it went cold. A terrifying predator was on the loose, and no one knew who he was, or if he would strike again. Then, in 1989, another tragedy struck in Orange County that would later prove to be connected. On February 19, 1989, the body of 27-year-old Renee Cuevas was discovered along a road near the now-closed El Toro Marine Corps Air Station in Irvine. Renee had been slain under strikingly similar circumstances. Like Shannon's case, Renee's also went unsolved, but investigators took note of the eerie resemblance between the two crimes. It wasn't until 2003 that a crucial clue finally linked the two slayings. Forensic scientists at the Orange County Crime Lab re-examined DNA evidence from both crime scenes and made a startling discovery. The DNA profile from Shannon Lloyd's perpetrator matched the person who had slain Renee. In other words, the same unknown man had committed both crimes. This revelation meant a serial predator had been at large in Orange County since the late 1980s, responsible for taking two young women's lives. Armed with this knowledge, authorities finally had a trail to follow, but the perp's identity was still a mystery. The DNA profile was uploaded to the National Criminal Database, but it didn't match any known offender at the time. The case remained cold, but investigators were now more determined than ever, knowing that solving either woman's slaying would solve both. By the late 2010s, a revolutionary investigative tool emerged in forensic science: genetic genealogy. This technique gained national fame in 2018 for helping identify the original Night Stalker, proving that even decades-old DNA could lead to a name by tracing family trees. In 2021, 34 years after Shannon's life was taken, Orange County's investigative genealogy unit turned its attention to the DNA from her case. Using advanced DNA analysis and family tree mapping, they identified a possible suspect, Reuben Smith. The name meant nothing to the original detectives, but it was about to unravel the whole mystery. Smith had lived in Orange County in the 1980s, not far from where the slayings occurred, before eventually moving to Nevada. Digging into his past, detectives discovered he had a history of violence. In July 1998, more than a decade after Shannon's slaying, Reuben Smith was arrested in Las Vegas for attempting to end the life of a woman after an indecent assault. That victim heroically fought off her attacker and survived, later recalling the evil she sensed in him and how she knew she had to fight for her life. Although Smith was charged for that 1998 attack, the case never went to trial. The charges were eventually dismissed, and he walked free. However, during that arrest, Las Vegas authorities collected a DNA sample from Smith, a sample that would turn out to be the key to solving Shannon's case. And as expected, this would of course crack Renee's case open as well. While it never ended up in any databases, it was stored by the Las Vegas cops. Once Smith's name surfaced through genetic genealogy, investigators pulled his 1998 DNA sample from storage and compared it to the DNA from the crime scenes. It was a perfect match, conclusively tying Reuben Smith to both slayings. The mystery of who ended the life of Shannon Lloyd was solved, It was the same man who had eluded justice all those years while leaving a trail of violence from Orange County to Las Vegas. Reuben Smith would never face a jury for his crimes, and, given the platform we're on, let's just say that he carried out the penalty for a capital offense on himself in July 1999. His grim end meant he escaped justice before anyone realized the full enormity of what he had done. For the families of Shannon Lloyd and Renee Cuevas, learning the identity was a bittersweet revelation. On one hand, they finally knew who was responsible and that he could never hurt anyone else. On the other, Smith's death meant there would be no criminal trial, no opportunity to see him held accountable in court. Still, the resolution brought a measure of closure that had been denied for so long. Shannon's brother expressed gratitude for the detectives and forensic experts who never gave up on his sister's case, and he took comfort that the truth was finally known. Likewise, Renee Cuevas's relatives thanked law enforcement for their persistence and said that knowing the perpetrator's name brought some peace to their family. Investigators have also begun looking into the possibility that Smith had other victims during his years in California and Nevada, an open question they continue to pursue. Right now, though, no other crimes have been confirmed, though the authorities have confirmed they are investigating him as a potential serial perpetrator. That said, I find it difficult to believe that Reuben Smith struck twice in the late 80s, then attempted to do the same thing in 1998, with no attacks in between. Generally, these sorts of predators are emboldened when they get away with it to the level that Smith did. Notably, he wasn't even a suspect in the case of Shannon or Renee, and had never been interviewed or taken in for questioning. Further, it's somewhat suspicious that he took the approach that he did in 1999, unless he thought there was credible evidence out there that could turn up further victims. The summer of 1518 in Strasbourg saw one of history's strangest epidemics, a dancing plague in which dozens of people danced compulsively in the streets for weeks on end. Contemporary reports describe the sufferers flailing their arms and convulsing uncontrollably, faces dripping with sweat and feet bleeding through their shoes. These weren't joyous revelers, but ordinary citizens seized by a mysterious compulsion, and some danced themselves to exhaustion or even death as crowds watched in disbelief. In July 1518, a woman named Frau Trophäa suddenly stepped into a Strasbourg street and began dancing without rest, as if entranced. Within days, dozens of others had joined her, caught up in the same unexplainable urge to dance. The dancing epidemic spread to as many as 400 people, all swaying and twirling in a trance-like state. Many dancers collapsed from sheer exhaustion. Some reportedly suffered fatal strokes or heart attacks as the marathon dancing went on and on. The strange episode persisted into September, shocking the city's authorities and baffling all who witnessed it. Strasbourg's city leaders were alarmed by this bizarre plague and struggled to find a remedy. At first, they consulted the town's physicians, who declared the dance to be a natural illness caused by overheated blood. Under the medieval humoral understanding of medicine, an excess of hot blood needed to be expelled from the body. Following this advice, the authorities encouraged the afflicted to continue dancing the sickness out. The idea was that if the sufferers danced continuously, the fever of the dance would burn itself out. This well-intentioned cure, however, backfired horribly. The sight of dozens of people dancing madly in public only fueled the town's superstition. Many onlookers believed the dancers were victims of St. Vitus's curse, a divine punishment forcing sinners to dance, and they feared that they could be next. In the fervor, even more people joined in the compulsive dance, swept up by what we might now call crowd psychology. One later chronicle claimed that at the peak of the plague, as many as 15 people a day were dying from strokes, heart failure, or exhaustion, and the city authorities realized their mistake. Instead of encouraging dancing, they now banned all forms of shimmying and shaking in Strasbourg. Finally, in late August, officials gathered the remaining afflicted dancers, loaded them into wagons, and sent them to a shrine of St. Vitus in the nearby mountains. According to reports, priests at the shrine performed a special ritual to cure the dancers. The exhausted men and women were given small crosses to hold and made to wear red shoes painted with holy crosses on the soles. They were led around a wooden effigy of St. Vitus, while priests chanted prayers and sprinkled holy water and consecrated oil. This act of devotion, combined with the distance from the public eye, seemed to break whatever spell had gripped them. Word soon spread that St. Vitus had forgiven the sufferers, and the dance mania gradually subsided. By early September 1518, the plague had finally run its course, and the city fell quiet, left to wonder what exactly had just happened. For all the relief at its end, one question remained. What caused this bizarre outbreak? Despite becoming the most well-known dancing mania, the 1518 incident was far from an isolated case. In fact, outbreaks of uncontrollable dancing had occurred in Europe before, especially in the Rhine River region. A particularly large eruption in 1374 saw people in dozens of towns convulsing in dance until they collapsed. However, there are documented cases going back to the 10th and 11th centuries in what is now Germany and Italy. Yet the Strasbourg episode of 1518 was the last and best documented of these strange events, and even in its own time people struggled to explain it. Contemporary observers offered both supernatural and natural theories. Many among the pious believed it was the work of divine wrath or demonic possession. The curse of St. Vitus was a primary suspect, which is why so many victims and their families turned to prayer and saintly intercession. Meanwhile, doctors and city officials dismissed otherworldly causes and blamed physical or psychological ones, such as an excess of hot blood overwhelming the brain. The famed physician Paracelsus, who visited Strasbourg a few years later, even put forward an eccentric theory that the plague began as a kind of ruse. He claimed Frau Trophea had feigned her affliction to embarrass her husband, and that other women began dancing to thumb their noses at their own husbands. While his explanation now seems absurd, and was likely even then a minority view, it at least shifted the blame from angry saints and demons toward human psychology. In truth, no consensus existed at the time. The people of 1518 were grasping for answers to an event that must have felt as inexplicable as it was terrifying. In modern times, historians and scientists have continued to puzzle over the dancing plague of 1518. Several hypotheses have been proposed, but only one has gained broad acceptance. One suggestion is food poisoning, the idea that villagers might have consumed bread made from rye tainted with ergot, a fungus that can produce hallucinations and convulsions. Notably, this theory was once widely accepted by academics as the likely cause of the event. However, this theory is now largely discounted since ergot poisoning renders individuals bedridden after an initial burst of energy. This, of course, doesn't fit with people dancing for months on end. Another theory claims that the dancers were members of a heretical religious sect or cult engaging in ecstatic ritual. However, there's no direct evidence for any secret cult involvement, and this idea remains speculative and not widely supported by historians. The most widely accepted explanation for the 1518 dancing plague is that it was a case of mass psychogenic illness. Essentially, it was a mass hysteria triggered by extreme stress and pervasive fear. Strasbourg in 1518 was a community under enormous strain. The region had been struck by a series of bad harvests and famine, and was stalked by diseases like smallpox and the recently arrived syphilis. Facing hunger and illness, people also shared a deep-seated cultural superstition, a belief that St. Vitus could punish sinners by making them dance uncontrollably. In a state of heightened anxiety, one person's spontaneous dancing could unconsciously set off a chain reaction. Modern psychologists now accept that in certain contexts, groups of people can exhibit physical symptoms with no obvious physical cause. In 1518, the citizens of Strasbourg arguably experienced just such a phenomenon. The first dancer, Frau Trofea, might have been the spark, and the city's collective stress and belief in the curse of St. Vitus was the tinder. As the fear spread, dozens of others essentially tranced themselves into the same hysterical dance. The fact that the sufferers truly couldn't control their movements, yet later recovered, aligns with what we now understand about psychosomatic disorders fueled by stress and expectation. In other words, the dancing plague was likely a massive stress-induced psychosis that spread by example and suggestion through an anxious community. That said, while this hypothesis has gained widespread acceptance, it hasn't yet been definitively proven. In fact, over the centuries, a number of proposed causes have reached consensus-level understanding, only to go out of fashion. If you asked an educated person 500 years ago, they would have almost certainly talked about overheated blood. Fast forward to 50 years ago, and the modern-day equivalents were talking about rye bread and ergot. Now here we are in the present day, and mass psychogenic illness is the present consensus amongst scholars. Perhaps in another 50 years, it'll be something different entirely.